Did you write these letters? Is it true? Annie asked. Is it true that you wrote them? Did you write these letters, Mr. Whitmore? Annie Johnson stood outside the iron gate of Richard Whitmore's mansion with a rusted tin box pressed against her chest. Richard Whitmore stood on the front steps in a dark robe over pressed pajamas. He looked annoyed. Richard glanced at the tin box in Annie's arms. He looked back at Annie. I do not know what you are talking about. Annie stepped closer to the gate. You do not know. No, Richard said. I do not. You do not know Denise Johnson. There are many women named Denise Johnson. Richard said. I am sure Georgia has more than a few. My mother worked for your company. A lot of people worked for my company. You sent letters to her. I never sent letters to anyone by that name. Annie lifted the tin box slightly. You are the person who sent these letters to my mother. Your name is written on the envelopes. Richard gave a short breath through his nose. Anyone can write a name on an envelope. Annie stared at him. That is your answer. That is the obvious answer. You expect me to believe someone else used your name. Richard took one slow step down from the porch. Maybe someone wanted your mother to open the letters. Maybe someone thought my name would get her attention. My mother did not want your attention. Richard's mouth tightened. Maybe someone was trying to flirt with her. People do strange things. Annie went still. Richard looked at the guards, then back at Annie. Young lady, you came to my home at sunrise. You woke my staff. You were standing at my gate with a box and a story. Do you have nothing better to do than run here and disturb people while they are sleeping? Do you understand how early it is? I understand exactly how early it is, Annie said. My mother was awake before sunrise, too. She was awake most nights because of those letters. This is ridiculous, Richard said. I do not have an obligation to stand here and explain myself to you. You do when your name is on the envelopes. Richard turned toward the guard. Close the gate. The guard pressed the control. The iron gate began to move with a low mechanical hum. Annie stepped forward and shoved both hands against the bars. Miss stepped back, the guard said. Annie pushed harder. The gate pressed against her shoulder, but she forced herself through before it could close. The tin box scraped against the iron. The guard hit the emergency stop and the gate froze halfway open. Annie stood inside the property line, breathing hard. Richard's expression changed. You just forced your way onto private property. Annie looked at him. You tried to close the gate before you answered me. I already answered you. No, Annie said. You lied. Before Richard could speak, the mansion's front door opened. An elderly white woman stepped out in a cream house coat with a silk scarf tied at her neck. What does that mean? She had Richard's eyes, but hers were sharper. She held the railing with one hand and looked from her son to Annie with the irritated dignity of a woman who was not used to noise before breakfast. Richard, the woman said, what is all this noise so early in the morning? Richard exhaled. Mother, please go back inside. I asked you a question. Richard pointed toward Annie. This girl came out of nowhere. She is asking whether I wrote letters to her mother. His mother looked Annie up and down. What is your name? My name is Annie Johnson. And your mother is Denise Johnson. The woman frowned. Do we know what Denise Johnson? Richard said. She claims her mother worked for the company. My mother did work for Whitmore Development. Annie said she worked in internal compliance. Richard's mother looked at the tin box. What letters are you talking about? Annie held the box tighter. The letters inside this box. My mother received them for 2 years. Your son's name is on the envelopes. The old woman gave a small laugh. My dear, my son does not send random letters to women. Women line up to get Richard's attention. They wait months to sit beside him at charity dinners. They donate to hospitals and museums just to have 5 minutes with him. Richard certainly does not need to send private letters to some woman in secret. My mother was not trying to get him. That is what many women say. Mrs. Whitmore, Annie said, my mother wanted your son to leave us alone. The woman's smile faded. You should be careful with your words. Annie opened the tin box. She took out one folded letter. The paper was old and creased from being read too many times. Her hand shook once, but she steadied it. She unfolded the page and read clearly. Denise, if you tell anyone what you saw, I will make sure you regret it. You will lose your job, your name, and your daughter's future. Do not mistake my silence for mercy. If you expose the truth, I will not spare you. Richard's mother stared at Annie. Give me that letter. Richard stepped between them. Mother, no. The old woman held out her hand. Richard, move. This girl is trying to provoke us. Richard said, you do not need to read anything. I said, move. Richard did not move fast enough. His mother stepped around him, reached through the half-opened gate, and snatched the letter from Annie's hand. She unfolded it herself, though the page trembled slightly between her fingers. When she reached the signature at the bottom, her face changed. Richard said, "That is not mine." His mother did not look at him yet. "Your name is here. Anyone can write my name." Annie said, "There are dozens more." Richard turned on her. "You do not know what you are holding." Annie's voice stayed quiet. "I know my mother cried every time she read one." Mrs. Whitmore lowered the letter slowly and looked at her son. "Richard, what truth is this letter talking about?" Richard's jaw tightened. "This is a setup." "A setup by whom?" "By someone who wants money. By someone who wants attention. By someone who knows my name carries weight." Mrs. Whitmore looked down at the letter again. "This does not sound like a man being used. This sounds like a man giving orders." Richard's face hardened. "Mother, you are embarrassing yourself." "No," she said, "you are embarrassing me." Annie picked up the tin box again. "My mother hid these letters under her bed because she thought silence would protect me. She was wrong. Silence only protected you." Richard stared at her, but Annie did not look away. Mrs. Whitmore still held the letter in her hand. Annie stepped backward toward the open gate. "You said you do not know anything." Annie said, "Fine, take the day and remember." Then Annie walked out through the gate before either guard could stop her. At the road, she turned back once. Richard Whitmore did not move until Annie disappeared beyond the curve of the road. His mother still held the letter in her hand. She was not reading it anymore, but she had not given it back. Richard turned toward the nearest guard. "Close the gate." The guard looked at Mrs. Whitmore first, then obeyed. The iron bars slid shut. Richard faced his mother. "Give me the letter." Mrs. Whitmore folded the page once slowly. "You may ask me properly." "Mother, give me the letter." "No." Richard's face flushed. He took one hard step forward, then stopped himself. His bare foot struck the stone loud enough to make the guard look up. "This is absurd," Richard snapped. "A girl walks in here at dawn with some rusty box, reads one piece of paper, and suddenly, everyone stands around like I have been caught robbing a bank." Mrs. Whitmore looked at him over the top of the letter. "You are shouting." "I am shouting because this is ridiculous. I am angry because I was dragged out of bed by a teenager with nothing better to do than harass me at my own home. That girl had a name." Mrs. Whitmore looked annoyed. Richard threw one hand toward the road. "Fine, Annie Johnson. She came from nowhere. She waved around some letters and now you are looking at me as if you do not know your own son." Mrs. Whitmore's voice stayed cold. "I know my son very well. That is why I am asking what truth the letter was talking about." Richard stared at her for the first time that morning. His careful expression broke. He paced once across the steps, robe swinging loose at his knees. "Let me explain the letters," he said. "So there are letters." Richard stopped. Mrs. Whitmore lifted the page. "You just said letters." "I meant whatever she brought." "No, Richard, you meant letters." He pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. "Mother, you have never understood how ugly business can get. I understand more than you think. No, you understand charity dinners and board seats in which judge likes bourbon. You do not understand what happens when a former employee gets confused about what she saw and decides to turn company documents into leverage." Denise Johnson was confused. She was ambitious. She worked in internal compliance. She saw fragments of things she did not understand. "And you wrote to her?" Richard's jaw tightened. "I did not write that letter." Mrs. Whitmore unfolded the page again. "This letter says, if you expose the truth, I will not spare you." That is not a business explanation. That is a threat. Richard stepped closer, then seemed to remember the guards. He lowered his voice, but anger still shook through it. "Someone is setting me up. That girl, her mother, maybe someone behind them. They know my name carries weight. They want money, attention, maybe protection from something Denise did herself." Mrs. Whitmore looked at him for a long moment. "Then you will not mind if I keep this?" His eyes sharpened. "You will do no such thing. I will keep it until I decide what I believe." "Mother, no." "Richard, I watched your father lie with a calm face for 30 years. Do not stand on my steps and use his voice." That struck him harder than Annie's accusation. Mrs. Whitmore turned and walked back inside with the letter still in her hand. Richard remained on the steps, breathing through his nose, his hands opening and closing at his sides. Then he turned to one of the guards. "Find out where that girl goes," he said quietly. The guard nodded. Richard looked toward the road where Annie had gone. "And call Marcus," he added. Now, Annie did not know any of that. As she reached the bus stop half a mile away, she sat on the bus shelter bench. Annie's phone buzzed. "Mama." She let it ring once, then answered. "Annie," Denise Johnson said, "where are you?" "I'm coming home." "That is not what I asked." Annie looked down the road toward the Whitmore estate. "I'm near Buckhead." Silence filled the line. Tell me you did not go there, Denise said. Mama, tell me you did not take that box to his house. Annie closed her eyes. I had to. No, baby, you did not have to do that. You come home right now. You come straight home. The bus arrived before Annie could answer. She climbed on, paid the fare, and sat where she could see both doors. She slipped her phone into her coat pocket. Mrs. Evelyn Carter arrived with coffee, butter biscuits, and the kind of silence older women carried when they already knew trouble had entered a house before anyone explained it. She stepped into the Johnson kitchen holding a casserole dish wrapped in a towel. I brought breakfast because frightened people forget to eat. Denise managed a tired smile. You always bring food like somebody died. Mrs. Carter set the dish on the counter. That is, because half the time I show up, somebody's common sense already has. Annie almost laughed. Mrs. Carter noticed the tin box immediately. Her eyes rested on it for a second longer than normal, then moved to Denise's face. How bad is it? She asked quietly. Denise looked down at her coffee mug. Worse than I wanted it to become. Mrs. Carter pulled out a chair and sat at the kitchen table without asking permission. She had lived beside the Johnsons for nearly 15 years. After Annie's grandmother died, Mrs. Carter became the kind of neighbor who kept spare keys, dropped off soup during flu season, and noticed when porch lights stayed off too long. What did the girl do? She asked. Denise rubbed her forehead. She marched up to Richard Whitmore's front gate at sunrise. Mrs. Carter slowly turned toward Annie. You did what? Annie folded her arms. Somebody had to stop hiding. Mrs. Carter leaned back in her chair. Baby, there's a difference between courage and walking barefoot into traffic. He threatened my mother. I know men like him, Mrs. Carter said. They smile at ribbon cutings while somebody else cleans blood off the floor behind them. Denise looked at Annie. Richard's mother read one of the letters. Mrs. Carter's eyebrows lifted. Well, now, questioned him, Annie said. At least for a second, she did. And what did Richard do? He got angry. Mrs. Carter nodded slowly, almost to herself. Good. Denise frowned. Good. Powerful men are careful when they lie. Anger makes them sloppy. Annie looked at the older woman. You really think he's scared? Mrs. Carter reached for the tin box. May I? Denise hesitated, then nodded. Mrs. Carter opened the lid carefully, like she expected something alive to jump out. Inside were stacked envelopes, some yellowed, some newer, all worn from Denise's hands. Mrs. Carter picked one up and read the outside. Denise Johnson, Richard Whitmore, no return address. Mrs. Carter exhaled softly. Lord, Annie watched her. Mama said, you used to teach history. I taught history for 37 years. Mrs. Carter slid the envelope back into the box. Which means I spent 37 years watching people with money rename fear into policy. Denise stared into her coffee. I should have burned them. No, Annie said immediately. Mrs. Carter nodded. No, you shouldn't have. Denise looked exhausted now, older than she had the day before. Every night I thought about it. Every single night, but if I burned them, then I'd start wondering if maybe I imagined things. At least with the letters, there was proof I wasn't losing my mind. Nobody spoke for a moment. The kitchen clock ticked loudly against the silence. Mrs. Carter finally asked, how many copies? Annie answered first. Pictures on my phone. Copies in my email. Flash drive, too. Mrs. Carter looked impressed despite herself. Well, the child came prepared. She shouldn't have needed to, Denise muttered. But she did. Annie looked at her mother. Mama, you said Richard wanted you to sign papers. What exactly did he think you saw? Denise's fingers tightened around the mug. Money moving through shell companies. Unsafe material reports getting buried. Contracts rewritten after meetings. Neighborhood relocation plans hidden behind charity language. Mrs. Carter frowned. Relocation plans. They bought property cheap in black neighborhoods, Denise said quietly. Then they pushed taxes and rent high enough that families couldn't stay. Mrs. Carter shook her head slowly. Same game, different decade. Annie leaned forward. And if something went wrong, he wanted your name attached to it. Denise nodded once. Mrs. Carter looked at Annie carefully. Did Richard threaten you directly today? No, but he warned me. What kind of warning? Annie remembered his face at the gate. The calmness that felt worse than yelling. The kind where a man doesn't need to finish the sentence. Mrs. Carter sat back. That's the dangerous kind. Denise suddenly stood and walked to the kitchen window. She moved the curtain aside just enough to see outside. Annie noticed it immediately. Mama. Denise kept looking through the glass. There's a black sedan parked across the street. Annie stood up fast and moved beside her. A dark car sat near the curb half a block down. The engine was running. Mrs. Carter stayed seated. How long has it been there? Denise shook her head. I don't know. The three women watched in silence. Then the sedan slowly pulled away and disappeared around the corner. Annie looked at her mother. You see, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Denise crossed her arms tightly. You think because you confronted him, he's suddenly going to back away. Annie, men like Richard Whitmore don't lose sleep over people like us. Mrs. Carter answered before Annie could. Sometimes they do. Denise turned. Evelyn, no. Denise, listen to me. Mrs. Carter's voice changed now, firmer, carrying the authority of someone older than both fear and pride. If that man was innocent, he would have laughed this off and gone back inside. Instead, he got angry. His mother questioned him. Security froze. And now there's a car sitting outside your house before lunchtime. Denise said nothing. Mrs. Carter pointed toward the tin box. That box scares somebody. Annie slowly sat back down. Then maybe we finally stop acting scared of it, too. Mrs. Carter looked at Denise carefully. Who else knows? No one, Denise said. That needs to change. Denise looked uneasy. The fewer people involved, the safer Annie is, the quieter you stay. Mrs. Carter replied, the easier it becomes for a man like Richard to bury you. Annie looked between them. So, what do we do? Mrs. Carter reached for her coffee. First, we stopped treating this like a family secret. Secrets are where powerful people survive. Denise sank slowly back into her chair. I don't even know who to trust anymore. Mrs. Carter gave a dry smile. That part's easy. You trust old black women and church gossip. We kept half this country alive. Even Denise laughed a little at that. Then, Mrs. Carter's expression grew serious again. I know somebody, she said quietly. A reporter used to write investigations before a big paper pushed him out. White man, stubborn, drinks too much coffee, still hates rich crooks. Annie looked up immediately. You think he'd help us? Mrs. Carter nodded once. If the evidence is real, he won't sleep until he tears it open. Denise looked terrified by the idea. Annie looked ready. Mrs. Carter reached over and rested one hand on the tin box. For 2 years, she said softly. This thing sat under a bed like it was poison. Maybe it's time somebody treated it like evidence instead. Mrs. Carter made another pot of coffee before noon because, as she explained, bad news dries the throat faster than summer heat. The kitchen had become crowded without anyone noticing when it happened. Biscuit crumbs sat on the table beside open envelopes. Denise's reading glasses rested near the tin box. Annie's phone charger stretched across the counter. Sunlight moved slowly through the blinds while the three women stayed in the same room like stepping apart might let fear back in. Mrs. Carter reached into her purse and pulled out an old address book with pages curling at the corners. You still keep paper contacts? Annie asked. I survived 3 hurricanes and 2 power outages, Mrs. Carter replied. Paper never forgot my passwords. She flipped through the pages carefully until she stopped at a name. Daniel Price. Denise immediately shook her head. No, Mrs. Carter looked up. You know him. I know his articles. Denise crossed her arms. Richard destroyed that man years ago. That is exactly why I trust him. Mrs. Carter said. Annie leaned closer. What happened? Mrs. Carter removed her glasses. Daniel used to write investigations for the journal Constitution. Smart man kept digging into city contracts, redevelopment money, missing funds. Then he published a series about Whitmore buying properties through shell companies, and in 3 months later, Daniel lost his job. Nobody could prove Richard caused it. But funny things happen around rich men. Advertisers disappear. Editors get nervous. Stories stop being convenient. Denise looked uneasy. That is exactly why we should stay away from him. Mrs. Carter pointed toward the tin box. Denise, your problem is already standing in this kitchen. Pretending otherwise will not shrink it. Annie looked at the name again. Can we trust him? Mrs. Carter gave a small shrug. I trust 2 kinds of reporters. The ones too honest to quit and the ones too angry to stop. Annie almost smiled. Which one is he? Both. Denise walked to the sink and stared out the window again. Since the black sedan had circled the block earlier, she kept checking the street every few minutes without realizing it. Annie noticed. Mama. Denise did not turn around. What? You're doing it again. Doing what? Looking outside every 30 seconds. Denise gripped the edge of the sink. That is what fear does, Annie. It teaches your body habits before your mind catches up. Mrs. Carter nodded quietly. That part never leaves easy. The room fell silent for a moment. Then Annie's phone buzzed against the table. All 3 women looked at it. Unknown number. Denise went pale immediately. Do not answer. The phone kept vibrating. Annie stared at the screen until it stopped. Then another message appeared. We need to talk before this gets worse. No name, no signature, just the message. Mrs. Carter reached for the phone first. Do not reply. Denise whispered. He found her number already. Annie looked at her mother. You really think it's him? I think men like Richard never make calls themselves. Another message appeared. You were too young to understand what your mother did. Annie's jaw tightened. Mrs. Carter took the phone and switched it face down. That right there is how powerful people introduce fear politely. Denise sat down slowly. This is exactly what I was trying to prevent. No, Annie said quietly. This is what was already happening. I just finally saw it. The kitchen phone rang suddenly. All three women jumped. Mrs. Carter pressed one hand to her chest. Lord, I hate dramatic timing. Denise answered cautiously. Hello. Her shoulders eased a little after a second. Oh, Pastor Raymond. Mrs. Carter mouthed. Church ladies already moving. Denise listened for a minute, then softly and hung up. What did he want? Annie asked. He heard somebody talking outside the diner this morning about police cars going toward Whitmore's neighborhood. Denise rubbed her forehead. News travels fast. Mrs. Carter snorted. Baby, black churches knew things before the internet existed. Annie looked toward the tin box. Maybe that's good. Denise looked exhausted. Dangerous. Mrs. Carter leaned back in her chair. Danger was already mailed to this house one envelope at a time. Annie's phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail notification. Nobody moved. Finally, Annie pressed speaker. There was silence at first, then a man's voice. Calm, educated, older. Miss Johnson, my name is Marcus Hale. I represent Mr. Richard Whitmore. I strongly advise you and your mother to stop spreading false accusations before permanent damage is done. Possessing fraudulent documents and making threats against a respected businessman could expose both of you to serious legal consequences. I suggest you contact me before this situation escalates further. The message ended. Denise closed her eyes. Annie looked furious. He called us criminals. Mrs. Carter shook her head slowly. No, he called you dangerous. Denise stood up abruptly. That's enough, Annie. Give me your phone. No, Annie. I said no. You are not speaking to these people again. They're already speaking to me. Denise looked close to breaking now. Not angry anymore. Just tired in the deep way. Fear makes people tired. I wanted one normal life for you, she said quietly. One normal chance. Annie softened immediately. Mama, when your father left, I promised myself nobody else would decide what happened to us. Then Richard Whitmore walked into my life with a suit and a smile and made me afraid of my own mailbox. Mrs. Carter looked down into her coffee. Denise's voice shook now. Do you know what it feels like to hear your child sleeping down the hall and wonder if somebody powerful can erase her future with one phone call? Annie walked over slowly and took her mother's hands. Mama, look at me. Denise did. You already protected me for 2 years, Annie said. But protecting me cannot mean letting him win forever. Denise looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she sat back down and covered her eyes with one hand. Mrs. Carter quietly reached for the address book again. Daniel Price lives downtown now, she said. Tiny apartment above a watch repair shop, smells like old newspapers and bad decisions. Annie let out a small breath. You really think he'll help? Mrs. Carter nodded. If Richard Whitmore is involved, Daniel will answer the door before you finish knocking. Denise lowered her hand slowly. And if this destroys us? Mrs. Carter looked directly at her. Denise, fear already spent 2 years destroying you quietly. Maybe it is time to make noise back. The room went still again. Then Annie reached for the tin box and opened it carefully. Inside lay years of folded fear. This time, nobody tried to hide it under the bed. Daniel Price opened the door, wearing reading glasses, wrinkled jeans, and the expression of a man already tired of whoever was knocking. What, Mrs. Carter pushed past him before he could close the door again. Good afternoon to you, too, Daniel. Daniel blinked twice. Evelyn, you still alive? Unfortunately, the apartment smelled like old coffee, printer, ink, and paper that had stayed too long in sunlight. Stacks of newspapers covered half the floor. A small fan rattled near the window. On one wall hung framed front pages from investigations as Daniel had written years ago. Annie recognized one headline immediately. City contracts under investigation. Another frame farther down the wall had cracked glass. Whitmore Development denies fraud claims. Daniel followed Annie's eyes and gave a dry laugh. That article cost me my career. Mrs. Carter walked straight to the kitchen counter like she owned the place. You still drink terrible coffee. It's fresh. It smells like punishment. Denise remained near the door, uneasy. Annie stood beside her with the tin box held close against her side. Daniel noticed it immediately. What's in the box, Mrs. Carter answered before anyone else could. The reason you're about to have a better afternoon. Daniel rubbed his jaw. Evelyn, every time you say something like that, I end up getting threatened by lawyers. Then today will feel familiar. Daniel looked toward Annie. Who are you? My name is Annie Johnson. Something in Daniel's face sharpened slightly. Not recognition exactly. Instinct. And your mother? Denise spoke quietly. Denise Johnson. Daniel stared at her for 2 seconds longer than comfortable. Internal compliance. Denise's shoulders tightened. You remember me. I remember your resignation. Daniel closed the apartment door slowly. You disappeared right after I started digging into Whitmore's redevelopment. Contracts. Denise looked down. That was not a coincidence. Daniel motioned toward the small dining table buried under files. Sit down. Nobody moved immediately. Daniel sighed. If Richard Whitmore sent you, his lawyers would have arrived first. Sit. Annie set the tin box carefully on the table. Daniel looked at it. That thing better be worth the headache. It is, Annie said. Mrs. Carter pulled out a chair. The girl marched into Whitmore's driveway this morning and read one of the letters to his face. Daniel froze. She did what? She also read it to his mother. Daniel stared at Annie now like he was trying to decide whether she was brave or reckless. Which one are you? He asked. Annie answered honestly. I don't know yet. That almost made him smile. Daniel sat down opposite the box. Show me. Denise immediately spoke. Before we do anything, I need to know something. If Richard finds out we came here, he'll find out eventually, Daniel interrupted. And then what? Daniel leaned back in his chair. Then he'll do what men like Richard always do. He'll call you unstable, emotional, bitter, maybe dishonest. He'll bury you under paperwork and smile while doing it. Annie looked at him carefully. You really hate him. Daniel gave a tired laugh. No, hate takes energy. Richard Whitmore is just the kind of rich man who thinks poor neighborhoods exist to be rearranged like furniture. He looked at the box again. Open it. Annie lifted the lid. Daniel reached for the first envelope carefully. Not dramatically, just professionally. He checked the paper first, then the handwriting, then the fold marks. You kept originals, he said quietly. Denise nodded. Good. Daniel unfolded one letter and read silently. His face changed less than Annie expected, which somehow made it worse. How many are there? 37, Annie answered. Daniel looked up sharply. 37 threatening letters. Some worse than others, Denise said softly. Daniel read another one, then another. The apartment grew quieter with every page. Finally, he stopped and removed his glasses. Jesus, nobody spoke. Daniel looked at Denise. Why didn't you go to the police? Denise let out a small breath. And tell them what? That a billionaire was threatening me with letters signed in his own name. Half the city shakes his hand at charity dinners. Daniel nodded slowly. Fair point. He picked up another envelope. No postage. Hand delivered. Yes. Denise said. You ever see who dropped them off? No. Daniel tapped the paper lightly against the table. That means whoever delivered them knew your schedule. Annie looked at her mother. Denise's expression tightened immediately. Daniel noticed what? Denise hesitated. There was always a black SUV near the house after the letter started. Daniel leaned forward. License plate. No. Any neighbors notice? Mrs. Carter did. Mrs. Carter lifted one hand. I notice everything. That's what retirement is for. Daniel almost smiled again, but it faded quickly. He looked back at the letters. These aren't just threats, he said quietly. These are pressure tactics. Somebody wanted Denise scared enough to stay quiet, but calm enough not to run public. Annie sat straighter. That's exactly what happened. Daniel looked at her carefully now. And then you showed up at his gate. Yes. Why? Annie thought about it for a moment. Because my mother spent 2 years whispering in her own house. That answer stayed in the room. Daniel rubbed one hand over his face. Do you know what happens if this story is real? Denise answered first. Our lives get destroyed. No, Daniel said quietly. If this story is real, a lot of people's lives were already destroyed. Yours are just finally entering the same room. Silence settled again. Outside, traffic drifted through downtown Atlanta below the apartment windows. A siren sounded. Somewhere far off, Daniel stood and walked toward a filing cabinet near the wall. He unlocked the bottom drawer and pulled out several old folders stamped with Whitmore Development logos. Annie stared. You still kept everything. I keep receipts, too, Daniel said. Mrs. Carter pointed at Annie proudly. See, that's why I brought the girl. Daniel spread documents across the table beside the letters: property maps, financial reports, copies of city redevelopment proposals. Denise looked at one page and immediately went pale. "That account number," she whispered. Daniel looked up. "You recognize it?" Denise pointed at the page with a trembling finger. "That company was fake." The room changed instantly. Daniel leaned closer. "What do you mean fake?" "I mean, the address didn't exist." Denise swallowed hard. "I reported it internally." Annie looked at her mother and then the letters started. Denise nodded slowly. Daniel stared at the papers, then at the tin box. Finally, he said the words none of them had fully allowed themselves to say out loud yet. "This is bigger than threats." Daniel did not touch the letters again for several minutes. He stood by the apartment window with one hand against his mouth, staring down at the traffic below while Denise sat frozen at the table. Annie watched both of them carefully. It felt like the room had shifted into something heavier the moment Denise recognized the account number. Finally, Daniel turned around. "Tell me exactly what you found at Whitmore Development," he said. Denise shook her head immediately. "I already told you." "No," Daniel replied. "You told me enough to survive 2 years. I need enough to fight back." Denise looked exhausted just hearing the word fight. "Mrs. Carter quietly pushed a fresh mug of coffee toward her. "Drink something before fear dries you into dust." Denise gave a weak smile and wrapped both hands around the mug. Daniel pulled out a yellow legal pad and clicked a pen open. "Start with the fake company." Denise stared at the papers on the table for a moment before speaking. The company was called Green Valley Urban Housing Initiative. Daniel snorted softly. "That already sounds fake." It was listed as a subcontractor connected to relocation support for redevelopment projects. Meaning they claimed they helped displaced residents move into affordable housing. Daniel wrote quickly. "And the address?" "A mailbox store outside Mon." Annie frowned. "That's it." Denise nodded. "No office, no employees, no registered staff. But somehow they received millions." Daniel looked up. "Transferred from Whitmore through community grants and city redevelopment funds." Mrs. Carter shook her head slowly. "Lord." Daniel kept writing. "And you reported this." "I filed an internal compliance concern." Denise swallowed hard. 3 days later, my access permissions changed." "What kind of changes?" "I lost access to financial review systems. Meetings stopped appearing on my schedule. People I worked with suddenly avoided eye contact." Annie looked at her mother. "And Richard called you into his office?" Denise nodded once. Daniel leaned forward. "Tell me exactly what he said." Denise's fingers tightened around the mug. "He told me successful companies survive because employees know the difference between loyalty and panic." "That sounds like him," Daniel muttered. "He said investigations destroy communities. He said one scandal could cost thousands of jobs." Denise paused. Then he slid a folder across the desk. "What was inside?" "Documents already prepared with my signature block." Daniel's expression darkened. "Prepared for what?" "For responsibility." The apartment fell quiet again. Annie felt cold despite the heat coming through the windows. Daniel spoke carefully now. He wanted a fall person. Denise gave a small nod. "Someone ordinary. Someone believable." Mrs. Carter looked disgusted, meaning black. Nobody answered because nobody had to. Daniel tapped the pen against the table. "Did you sign anything?" "No." "What did Richard do?" "At first, nothing." Denise laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "That was the frightening part." He smiled. "He thanked me for my honesty. He asked about Annie's school applications." Annie felt her stomach tighten. Denise looked down at her coffee. Then the letters started arriving. Daniel reached toward the tin box again. "The threats escalated over time." "Yes, you kept all of them in order." Denise nodded. Daniel carefully stacked the letters by date across the table. Annie watched him work. He moved differently now, more awake, more focused, like an old engine turning over after years sitting cold. He suddenly stopped at one envelope. "Wait." Denise looked up. Daniel pointed to the corner of the paper. "This watermark." Annie leaned closer. "What about it?" "This stationery came from Whitmore corporate offices." Daniel held the envelope toward the light. "I remember because I used to photograph executive correspondence for a story years ago." Expensive paper customized order. Richard's denial at the gate suddenly sounded weaker in Annie's head. Mrs. Carter leaned back slowly. "So the man lied before breakfast." Daniel ignored the joke. He looked at Denise. "Do you still have access to any former coworkers?" "No. No friends there. People stopped calling after I left." Daniel nodded like he expected that answer. "Fear spreads through offices faster than mold." Annie stared at the papers covering the table. "So what happens now?" Daniel looked directly at her. "Now we verify everything before Whitmore's lawyers start burning holes through your front door." Denise's shoulders tightened again. Daniel noticed immediately. I'm not trying to scare you. You don't have to, Denise said quietly. Mrs. Carter pointed at Daniel with her coffee spoon. Watch your tone. The woman already lived 2 years inside a threat. Daniel sighed and softened slightly. Sorry. He sat back down and opened one of the old folders from his filing cabinet. Inside were newspaper clippings, copied contracts, maps with highlighted neighborhoods, and photographs of demolition sites. Annie picked up one photo. Family stood outside a boarded apartment building holding trash bags and plastic containers. A little black boy sat on a mattress near the curb while construction equipment waited behind him. What happened here? Annie asked. Daniel looked at the photo. Old 4th Ward redevelopment project. Whitmore bought the land through subsidiaries. Rent tripled within a year. Residents got pushed out. Mrs. Carter stared at the image. That little boy looks younger than my grandson was. Daniel pointed toward another document, and according to city reports, relocation assistance funds disappeared during the same period. Denise closed her eyes briefly. Green Valley. Daniel nodded. Annie looked from the photo to the letters. Suddenly, the whole thing felt larger. This wasn't just about us, she said quietly. No, Daniel replied. It never was. The room grew still again. Then Daniel's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen and immediately frowned. What? Annie asked. Daniel turned the phone over without answering. Unknown number. Mrs. Carter snorted. Well, that didn't take long. The phone buzzed again. Then again. Finally, Daniel answered and put it on speaker. A smooth male voice filled the apartment. Mr. Price, this is Marcus Hale, legal counsel for Mr. Richard Whitmore. I understand you may have recently been approached by individuals attempting to spread defamatory claims regarding my client. Nobody spoke. Marcus continued calmly. Mr. Whitmore would strongly advise against involving yourself in another damaging false narrative. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. Funny, I don't remember asking Richard Whitmore for advice. You have a history of reckless reporting and your client has a history of frightened employees. There was a pause. Then Marcus said, be careful which side of this situation you choose. Daniel's mouth curved slightly. That's the thing about journalism, Marcus. People like your client already chose the sides for the rest of us. He ended the call. The apartment stayed silent for 2 seconds. Then Mrs. Carter muttered, well, that sounded expensive. Annie looked at Daniel carefully. Are you still willing to help us? Daniel stared at the letters spread across his table. Then he looked at Denise. You spent 2 years protecting your daughter, he said quietly. The least I can do is spend a few weeks making sure a billionaire doesn't bury both of you. Denise looked overwhelmed by relief and fear at the same time. Daniel stood and grabbed his car keys from the counter. Where are we going? Annie asked. Daniel looked at the folders, then at the tin box to find out how many bodies are buried underneath Richard Whitmore's buildings. Daniel's car smelled like coffee, old paper, and cigarette smoke that had probably soaked into the seats years ago and refused to leave. Annie sat in the back beside the tin box while Denise stayed quiet in the passenger seat, arms folded tightly across her chest. Mrs. Carter had insisted on coming, too. Somebody needs to supervise foolishness, she said while climbing into the car. Downtown Atlanta moved past the windows in layers. Office towers gave way to older brick buildings, pawn shops, murals, churches, barber shops, and empty lots swallowed by weeds. Daniel drove with one hand on the wheel and the other tapping impatiently against the door. Where exactly are we going? Denise finally asked. Daniel looked through the windshield. Count Record's office first. Mrs. Carter snorted softly. Nothing says adventure like paperwork. Daniel almost smiled. Paperwork destroys more lives than bullets ever will. Annie watched people moving along the sidewalks outside. Delivery drivers, nurses, men carrying ladders into construction sites, teenagers waiting at bus stops with backpacks hanging low from tired shoulders. The city looked normal. That was the strange part. Richard Whitmore had spent years building fear quietly enough that the rest of Atlanta could still stop for coffee without noticing. Daniel parked beside an aging government building with stained concrete walls and narrow windows. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old printers. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A tired clerk glanced at them without interest. Daniel signed them in and led the group toward a row of public computer terminals. Annie leaned toward him. You've done this before too many times. He typed quickly, pulling up property transfers connected to Whitmore Development. Parcel numbers filled the screen. LLC names, redevelopment grants, tax adjustments. Denise suddenly pointed at one entry. That company again. Green Valley Urban Housing Initiative. Daniel clicked deeper. A list of transactions appeared. Millions of dollars moved through accounts connected to housing assistance programs. Another shell company appeared beneath it. Then another. Mrs. Carter frowned at the screen. Why does every fake company sound like a church fundraiser? Because fraud works best when it sounds charitable, Daniel replied. Annie watched Daniel's face tighten as he opened another document. What is it? She asked. Daniel pointed at the address listed for one of the companies. That building burned down 4 years ago. Denise blinked. What? It's abandoned. Daniel clicked another file. But according to these records, Whitmore subcontracted relocation work there last year. Annie felt a chill move through her. So, they were moving money through companies that didn't even exist. Daniel nodded slowly. And somebody approved every payment. Denise looked sick now. Richard wanted my signature on some of those authorizations. Mrs. Carter muttered under her breath. Lord have mercy. Daniel printed several documents and spread them across the desk beside the computer. Annie stared at the numbers. Most of it looked confusing until Daniel circled certain sections with a pen. See this? He asked. Federal redevelopment grants, tax relief programs, housing relocation funds, money intended for low-income neighborhoods. He pointed at another line. Then suddenly, the funds disappear into subcontractors connected to Whitmore projects. Annie looked at the photographs attached to some files. Entire apartment blocks marked for demolition. Elderly tenants standing outside with folded chairs and trash bags. One image showed an old black woman sitting beside a shopping cart full of belongings while bulldozers waited behind police tape. Mrs. Carter stared at the photo for a long time. That woman's old enough to remember segregation, she said quietly, and now she's losing her home to men wearing suits instead of uniforms. Nobody answered. Daniel gathered the papers carefully. This isn't enough yet. It looks like enough to me, Annie said. It's enough to suspect, Daniel corrected. Not enough to survive court. Denise looked nervous again. Maybe we should stop here. Daniel turned toward her. You think Richard Whitmore stops now? Denise lowered her eyes. Before anyone could speak again, Annie noticed a man standing near the entrance. Dark jacket, baseball cap, watching them. The moment Annie looked directly at him, he turned away and walked outside. Her stomach tightened. Daniel. He followed her gaze immediately. The reporter's expression hardened. Stay here. Daniel walked quickly toward the entrance, but by the time he stepped outside, the man was gone. Only a black SUV remained parked across the street. Denise saw it through the window and went pale instantly. That's the same kind of vehicle. Mrs. Carter looked irritated more than frightened. These people really need hobbies. Daniel returned a moment later. Everybody grab your things. Annie stood. Was he following us? I don't know yet. That means yes, Mrs. Carter muttered. Daniel stuffed the printed records into a worn leather bag. We're done here. As they moved toward the exit, Annie noticed the clerk at the front desk watching them now. Not curious, nervous. Outside, the afternoon heat pressed down heavily across the sidewalk. The black SUV remained parked across the street with tinted windows, hiding whoever sat inside. Denise slowed immediately. Daniel quietly said, keep walking. Annie tightened her grip on the tin box. The SUV engine started. Nobody spoke. Mrs. Carter leaned closer to Annie as they crossed toward the parking lot. Baby, if rich people start following you, it means you finally stepped on something expensive. The SUV pulled away from the curb slowly. Then it drove past them once. Not fast, not threatening, just slow enough. Annie could feel eyes behind the tinted glass. Then the vehicle continued down the street and disappeared into traffic. Denise stopped beside Daniel's car. This is a mistake. No, Annie said quietly. This is confirmation. Denise turned sharply. You think this is some game, Annie? Those people can ruin us. They already tried. They can do worse. Daniel unlocked the car doors. She's right about one thing. Denise looked at him. They're nervous now. Mrs. Carter climbed into the back seat with a grunt. Good. Nervous rich people make mistakes. Daniel looked around the street once before getting into the driver's seat. As he started the engine, his phone buzzed again. Unknown number. This time, he answered immediately. What? Marcus Hale's calm voice filled the car through the speaker. Mr. Price, I strongly advise you to stop involving yourself in private corporate matters. Daniel laughed once without humor. Following us to county records feels less private than you think. There was a pause. Then Marcus spoke again. You are putting innocent people in danger, Annie almost spoke. But Daniel lifted one finger to stop her. No, Daniel said quietly. Your client already did that. Marcus ignored the comment. Mr. Whitmore is willing to resolve this situation respectfully before unnecessary damage spreads. Denise whispered, resolve. Daniel's eyes stayed on the windshield. Funny word. Men like Richard always use resolve when they mean bury. Marcus's voice cooled slightly. Be careful, Daniel. Last time you chased one of these stories, You lost your career. Daniel looked at Annie in the rearview mirror. Then he answered calmly, maybe I was supposed to lose it. Makes me a lot harder to buy now. He hung up. The car stayed silent for several seconds. Then Mrs. Carter adjusted her seatbelt and said, well, if the devil starts making phone calls personally, it usually means the fire reached his porch. By the time they returned to Daniel's apartment, the mood inside the car had changed. Nobody spoke much anymore. Fear had become real enough to sit beside them quietly. Daniel carried the county records upstairs while Annie followed with the tin box. Denise walked slower than before, checking over her shoulder every few steps. Mrs. Carter noticed it but said nothing. Inside the apartment, Daniel locked the door immediately and closed the blinds halfway. Mrs. Carter raised an eyebrow. You expecting company? I'm expecting lawyers, Daniel replied. Which is usually worse. He spread the new documents across the table beside the letters. Property maps overlapped with transaction reports until the whole table looked less like evidence and more like a city slowly being dissected. Annie sat beside the papers. What now? Daniel circled 3 company names with a marker. Now we connect these shell companies directly to Whitmore Development. Denise frowned. How? Bank records, contract signatures, internal approvals. Somebody always leaves fingerprints. Annie looked at the letters again. Richard already left fingerprints. Daniel shook his head. Threat letters prove intimidation. They don't prove financial fraud. Mrs. Carter settled into a chair with a tired sigh. The law really does enjoy making poor people work harder. Daniel almost smiled. That's because the law was built by people who could afford patience. His computer suddenly chimed with an incoming email. Daniel glanced at the screen. Then his expression changed. What? Annie asked. Daniel turned the monitor slightly toward them. The email subject read, Formal Notice of Defamation Liability. Denise's face drained of color immediately. Daniel opened it silently. A law firm letterhead appeared across the screen. Marcus Hale. The message accused Denise and Annie of possessing fabricated documents and attempting to extort Richard Whitmore through false allegations. It demanded the immediate surrender of all letters and records connected to Whitmore Development. Failure to comply would result in civil and criminal action. Mrs. Carter read over Daniel's shoulder. That man writes like a snake wearing cuff links. Annie's jaw tightened. They're trying to scare us. No, Daniel corrected quietly. They're trying to isolate you. Denise sat down slowly. Civil and criminal action. Daniel looked at her. That's meant to sound bigger than it is, but it still sounds big. That's the point. Annie stared at the screen. Can they actually arrest us? Daniel leaned back in his chair right now. Probably not. But people like Richard don't start by winning in court. They start by exhausting you. Mrs. Carter nodded. Fear burns money faster than gasoline. Another notification appeared on Daniel's phone. This time it was a news alert. Daniel opened it. His face darkened immediately. A local business site had just published a short article. Whitmore Development denies false harassment claims. The article never mentioned Annie or Denise by name, but the timing was too precise to be coincidence. It described a disgruntled former employee attempting to damage Whitmore's reputation using fabricated correspondence. Annie looked sick. They're already shaping the story. That's how rich people move, Daniel said. They get in front of truth before truth learns how to speak. Denise stared at the article silently. Annie could almost see the panic moving through her mother again, rebuilding itself piece by piece. Then Denise's phone rang. Everybody froze. Unknown number. Denise whispered, I can't. Mrs. Carter held out her hand. Give it here. Denise answered on speaker instead. Hello. A woman's voice came through. Professional controlled Miss Johnson. This is Karen from Midtown Community Health Clinic. I'm calling regarding your employment status. Denise closed her eyes. Karen continued carefully. Due to concerns raised during a background review connected to legal matters involving your previous employer, the clinic is placing your position under temporary suspension pending further clarification. Annie stood up immediately. This is because of Richard. Denise raised one hand to quiet her, though her own fingers were trembling. How long? Denise asked. We don't know yet, Karen replied softly. I'm sorry. The call ended. Nobody moved. Mrs. Carter muttered under her breath. There it is. Denise sat perfectly still for several seconds. Then she looked down at her hands. I told you, she whispered. I told all of you what he could do. Annie knelt beside her mother's chair. Mama, listen to me. No. Denise pulled away gently. You don't understand. This is how it starts. One phone call, then another. Then people stop answering you at church. Then your name changes shape in other people's mouths. Daniel looked furious now, though he kept his voice calm. Richard moved too fast. Mrs. Carter frowned. What does that mean? It means he's nervous. Daniel pointed at the suspension call. If he were truly untouchable, he would have waited. Instead, he started pushing pressure immediately. Annie looked at him. So, that's good. No, Daniel said honestly. It's dangerous. A loud knock suddenly hit the apartment door. Everyone jumped. 3 hard knocks. Nobody spoke. Daniel slowly stood. Stay here. He moved toward the door carefully and looked through the peephole. Then he cursed quietly. What is it? Annie whispered. Who? Daniel opened the door halfway. A man in a delivery uniform held out a thick envelope. Daniel Price. Yeah, signature required. Daniel signed quickly and shut the door. The envelope carried the logo of Whitmore Legal Group. Mrs. Carter stared at it. Lord, the rich really do spend money on stationery. Daniel opened the packet. Inside was a formal cease and desist order nearly 20 pages thick. Annie looked stunned. They actually sent papers to your apartment. They want a record, Daniel said. They want timestamps, pressure, documentation. Denise suddenly stood up. This is over. Annie turned. Mama, no, I mean it. Denise grabbed her purse from the chair. I will not let my daughter lose her future because I was too weak to handle this alone. You were never weak. I should have destroyed those letters. Mrs. Carter rose immediately. Denise, I'm serious. Denise looked at Daniel. You tried to help. Thank you, but this stops now. Annie stepped in front of her mother. And then what? We go home and wait for Richard to decide how much of our lives he wants left. At least we'll still have lives. Daniel spoke quietly from across the room. Denise, she turned. If you walk away now, Richard Whitmore learned something very important. Denise looked exhausted. What? Daniel folded the cease and desist papers slowly and dropped them onto the table beside the threat letters. That fear still works. Nobody spoke after Daniel said it. The apartment seemed smaller now. The letters, the legal papers, the printed county records, all of it covered the table like evidence from a crime scene nobody wanted to claim ownership of. Denise stood beside the chair with her purse hanging from one shoulder. Her face looked tired in a way Annie had never seen before. Not frightened, worn down, Mrs. Carter walked toward her slowly. Baby, sit down before panic starts making decisions for you. I already made one, Denise replied quietly. 2 years ago, I stayed quiet and look where silence brought you. Denise closed her eyes. Annie stepped closer to her mother. Mama, if we stop now, Richard wins. He already wins, Denise said. That's the part you still don't understand. Daniel leaned against the table. No, men like Richard only win when people believe they cannot lose. Denise looked at him sharply. Easy for you to say. You already lost your career once. Daniel nodded once. Exactly, which means he doesn't have much left to threaten me with. That landed harder than Annie expected. The room went quiet again until Mrs. Carter picked up one of the cease and desist papers and squinted at it. This thing is 20 pages long just to say, please be scared, she muttered. Annie almost smiled despite herself. Then Daniel's computer chimed again. Everyone looked over immediately. Another email. Daniel opened it carefully. This one contained only a single attachment. A photograph. Annie frowned. What is that? Daniel enlarged the image slowly. It was Denise's house taken from across the street. The timestamp showed less than an hour earlier. Nobody moved. Then Annie noticed something worse. The photograph had been taken while Mrs. Carter stood on the porch holding her coffee mug, meaning whoever sent it had been watching them all morning. Denise covered her mouth with one hand. Mrs. Carter's expression hardened instantly. Oh, now I'm angry. Daniel zoomed further in. At the bottom of the email sat one sentence. Good people get hurt when stories spread. Annie felt cold all over. Denise whispered. He's escalating. Daniel's jaw tightened. No, he's panicking. Mrs. Carter pointed toward the screen. That right there is not confidence. That is a rich man realizing his secrets learned how to walk. Annie looked at Daniel. Can we trace the email? Probably bounced through 5 servers before breakfast. Denise sat down slowly this time, like her legs no longer trusted the floor. I can't do this, she whispered. Annie immediately knelt beside her again. Mama, I mean it. Denise's eyes filled. I spent 2 years trying to keep you safe, and now strangers are taking pictures of our house. Annie looked at the photograph again, their small front porch, Mrs. Carter's flowers, the old wind chimes hanging near the screen door. Normal things suddenly looked vulnerable. Daniel stared at the image for a long moment before speaking. Richard made a mistake. Mrs. Carter looked over. You keep saying that because he keeps making them. Daniel pointed toward the screen. Threat letters are one thing. Surveillance photographs are another. If we document this correctly, it starts building a pattern. Denise laughed weakly through tears. You say that like patterns protect people. No, Daniel said quietly, but they exposed predators. The apartment buzzed softly with traffic noise from outside. Somewhere downstairs, somebody argued in Spanish near the sidewalk. Ordinary life kept moving while fear sat in the room with them. Then Annie noticed Daniel staring at one of the county documents again. What? Daniel pointed toward a list of approved redevelopment projects. This address. Annie leaned closer. It was an apartment complex on Atlanta's west side. Maplewood Terrace. Denise's expression changed instantly. Oh no. Annie looked at her mother. What is it? Denise pointed at the paper with trembling fingers. That was the project. Daniel frowned. Which project? The one Richard wanted me attached to. Mrs. Carter leaned forward. What happened there? Denise swallowed hard. 3 tenants died during demolition prep. The room froze. Annie stared at her mother. What? Denise looked sick now. The building had structural damage. Internal reports warned construction couldn't begin until repairs were finished. Her voice shook, but Whitmore accelerated the timeline. Daniel's face hardened. To save money, Denise nodded slowly. Part of the upper floor collapsed during utility work. 3 residents were still inside. Annie felt nauseous and Richard covered it up. He blamed subcontractors publicly. Denise looked down at the papers privately. He needed somebody inside compliance willing to approve revised safety records. Daniel whispered, Jesus Christ. Mrs. Carter removed her glasses slowly. 3 people died. Denise nodded once. Annie suddenly understood why the letters had frightened her mother so deeply. This had never just been fraud. It had blood attached to it. Daniel grabbed another folder from the cabinet and flipped through old newspaper clippings until he found a small article buried near the back. 3 dead in Westside building accident. Tiny headline, 2 paragraphs. No mention of Whitmore development beyond associated contractors. Daniel looked furious now. I remember this story. It disappeared in 2 days because Richard buried it. Denise whispered. Annie stared at the old article. 3 dead, hidden inside paperwork and legal language. While the city moved on, Mrs. Carter shook her head slowly. That man built his fortune on people too poor to sue him. Daniel suddenly stood up. What are you doing? Annie asked, calling someone. Who? A former city inspector. Daniel grabbed his phone. Retired now, drunk half the time, but he worked Maplewood Terrace after the collapse. Denise looked alarmed. Daniel, if he talks, we connect Whitmore directly to the deaths. And if he doesn't? Daniel looked toward the threat letters. Then Richard Whitmore just threatened the wrong family for nothing. He stepped toward the window while dialing. Nobody in the apartment noticed the black SUV parked quietly across the street below. The man Daniel called answered on the 4th ring with a cough rough enough to sound painful. What? Daniel walked farther from the table toward the apartment window. Tom, it's Daniel Price. A pause followed. Then the older man laughed once without humor. Well, hell, either somebody died or you finally got desperate enough to remember I exist. Possibly both. Tom Wheeler coughed again. That doesn't sound encouraging. Daniel glanced back toward the table where Annie and Denise sat beside the letters. I need to ask about Maplewood Terrace. Silence. Not ordinary silence. The kind that arrived when a name carried history. Finally, Tom spoke again. Slower now. You should leave that one buried. Daniel's voice stayed calm. 3 people died. 3 poor people died. Tom corrected bitterly. The city buried the story before the bodies were cold. Denise looked down immediately. Daniel pressed harder. Did Whitmore development ignore structural warnings? Tom gave another long silence. Then he asked quietly, who's with you right now? A former Whitmore compliance employee. Another silence. Nami. Daniel looked toward Denise. She shook her head immediately. Daniel ignored her. Denise Johnson. Tom inhaled sharply enough that the sound carried through the speaker. Well, he muttered. Then Richard finally has a real problem. Annie looked up quickly. Daniel leaned against the wall. Tom, tell me what happened. You asking as a reporter or as somebody trying not to get these women killed? Mrs. Carter muttered under her breath. I already like him. Daniel answered carefully. Both. Tom let out a tired breath. Maplewood Terrace failed inspection twice before the collapse. Support beams were compromised. Water damage underneath the west stairwell. My office recommended evacuation before demolition. Denise closed her eyes. Daniel spoke quietly. And then somebody above me changed the report. Annie felt her stomach tighten. Tom continued. 3 weeks later, utility crews started work before tenants were fully relocated. Upper flooring gave out. 3 residents got trapped. Mrs. Carter whispered, Lord. Daniel looked toward the old newspaper clipping on the table. Why wasn't Whitmore blamed publicly? Tom laughed again, bitter and exhausted. Because rich companies don't kill people directly. They hire enough middlemen to spread the blood around. Denise covered her face with one hand. Daniel asked the question anyway. Did Richard know the building was unsafe? Tom answered immediately this time. Absolutely. The apartment went still. Even the traffic outside seemed farther away. Annie stared at the phone speaker like the voice coming through it had just cracked open the whole city. Daniel lowered his voice. Can you prove it? Tom hesitated. Then he said, maybe. Everybody looked up. Tom continued carefully. I kept copies of the original inspection reports, not official copies. Personal copies. Daniel straightened immediately. You still have them. I kept them because I knew someday somebody might come asking. Denise looked terrified now. If Richard finds out, Tom interrupted her. Honey, if Richard Whitmore finds out, I'm 72 years old with high blood pressure and arthritis. What's he going to do? Ruin my credit. Mrs. Carter laughed despite herself. That's the spirit. Tom coughed again. Listen carefully. I want no emails, no phone details, no digital copies until I see what you actually have. Daniel nodded instinctively, even though Tom could not see him. Understood. There's a diner off Cascade Road, Tom said. Bluebird Cafe tomorrow morning 8 o'clock. Daniel looked toward Denise. Well, be there. No, Tom corrected. You'll decide tonight whether you're brave enough first. The line went dead. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Annie asked quietly, is this enough? Daniel stared at the phone. If Tom still has those reports, it changes everything. Denise looked pale. Or it gets all of us buried faster. Mrs. Carter pointed toward the letters. Baby fear already spent 2 years sitting at your dinner table. At least now it has competition. Daniel walked back toward the table and sat down heavily. For the first time since Annie met him, he looked genuinely shaken. Annie noticed. What? Daniel rubbed his face slowly. I chased the Maplewood story years ago. I thought I failed because I couldn't prove enough. He looked toward Denise. Turns out somebody was trying to hand me the proof the whole time. Denise shook her head. I didn't know who to trust. You trusted survival. Annie stared at the old newspaper clipping again. 3 deaths hidden inside a short article no one remembered. What were their names? She asked quietly. Daniel blinked. What? The people who died. Nobody answered immediately. Then Daniel searched for the old folder and found another page. He read softly. Lena Brooks, Samuel Turner, Patrice Ellis, Mrs. Carter closed her eyes briefly. People always remember the companies. Nobody remembers the tenants. Annie repeated the names silently in her head. Lena Brooks, Samuel Turner, Patrice Ellis. Real people, real deaths buried under legal language and construction permits. Suddenly, the letters felt heavier. Not because they carried threats. Because they carried proof of what Richard Whitmore had been protecting. Daniel's phone buzzed again. This time, everyone tensed immediately. Unknown number. Daniel answered without speaker. What? Marcus Hale's voice carried faintly through the receiver. Anyway, you are making a serious mistake. Daniel leaned back in his chair. You lawyers really need hobbies. This situation is escalating unnecessarily. 3 people died in a building tied to your client, Sance. Then Marcus replied carefully. Be very cautious about repeating accusations you cannot support. Daniel looked toward Denise, then toward the letters, then toward Annie. I think your client's getting nervous, he said. Marcus's tone cooled. Mr. Whitmore has spent 30 years building this city. Mrs. Carter whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Right on top of poor people. Daniel almost smiled. Marcus continued. You should ask yourself whether a frightened former employee and an emotional teenager are reliable sources. Annie stood immediately. Emotional. Daniel held up one hand to stop her. Then he answered quietly into the phone. You know what scares rich men most, Marcus. What? Witnesses who survive long enough to compare notes. He ended the call. The apartment stayed silent again. Outside, evening sunlight slipped lower between the downtown buildings. Across the street, the black SUV still sat parked near the curb. This time, Annie noticed it first. Danielle. He followed her gaze toward the window. The SUV remained motionless, watching. Mrs. Carter stood slowly beside Annie. Well, she said softly. Looks like tomorrow morning just became important. Annie barely slept. Daniel let Denise and Mrs. Carter take the bedroom while he unfolded an old couch near the window. Annie stayed awake in a chair beside the table, the tin box resting near her feet like something alive guarding the room. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, the black SUV finally disappeared from across the street. Nobody celebrated. By 7:30, Atlanta was already awake when Daniel drove them toward Cascade Road. Morning traffic crawled through intersections while gospel music played softly from an old radio station beneath the sound of tires on pavement. Denise kept looking at the mirrors. Mrs. Carter noticed. Baby, If somebody wants to follow us now, they already know where we're going. That is not comforting. It wasn't supposed to be. The Bluebird Cafe sat between a laundromat and a closed hardware store with faded paint peeling above the windows. The diner looked old enough to remember segregation and stubborn enough to survive it. Inside, the smell of bacon and burnt coffee wrapped around them immediately. Tom Wheeler sat alone in a back booth wearing a brown jacket and a Braves cap pulled low over gray hair. He looked exactly like somebody who had spent decades arguing with city officials and losing sleep over paperwork. When he saw Denise, his expression changed. "Well," he muttered quietly. "You're real." Denise stopped beside the table. "You remember me?" Tom nodded once. "I remember everybody who looked scared walking out of Whitmore's offices." Daniel slid into the booth across from him. Annie sat beside her mother while Mrs. Carter positioned herself at the end like security nobody had hired but everyone needed. A waitress arrived with coffee before introductions finished. Tom glanced around the diner carefully before speaking again. "Nobody followed you," Daniel answered. "Not that we saw." Tom snorted softly. "That usually means yes." He reached down beside the booth and lifted an old leather briefcase onto the table. Annie's stomach tightened immediately. Tom rested one hand on it but did not open it yet. "You understand what happens if these documents go public?" he asked quietly. Daniel nodded. "No," Tom corrected. "I mean really understand. Richard Whitmore doesn't just lose money if this blows open. Politicians lose donations. Contractors lose contracts. People with expensive watches suddenly stop returning phone calls." Mrs. Carter stirred sugar into her coffee. "Sounds like half the city deserves a bad morning." Tom almost smiled. Then he looked directly at Annie. "You're the one who confronted him." "Yes, that was either brave or unbelievably reckless. I'm still deciding." Tom studied her for a second longer, then slowly opened the briefcase. Inside sat folders thick with papers, inspection reports, engineering notes, photographs, signed memos. Denise stared at the top document and immediately went pale. "That's the original report," she whispered. Tom nodded. Before they changed it, Daniel pulled the file closer carefully. Across the top of the page, stamped in red, were the words, "Unsafe for occupancy." Annie looked at the date. 3 weeks before the collapse. Tom slid another paper across the table. "That's the revised version submitted." Later, Daniel compared them side by side. Entire sections had been removed. Structural warnings gone. Evacuation recommendations erased. Denise whispered, "Oh my God." Tom pointed toward the bottom signature line. "See whose approval appears there." Annie leaned closer. "Richard Whitmore. Not printed. Signed." The whole table went silent. Even the waitress slowed slightly while refilling coffee nearby, sensing something heavy hanging over the booth. Daniel looked up slowly. "You kept all this?" Tom nodded. "I started copying documents after city officials ordered us to stop inspecting certain Whitmore properties too closely." Mrs. Carter frowned. "That sentence alone sounds criminal." "It gets worse," Tom replied. He opened another folder. Photographs spilled across the table. Collapsed flooring, concrete dust, ambulance. A firefighter carrying a little girl wrapped in a blanket. Annie looked away for a second. Tom's voice lowered. "That little girl survived. Her grandmother didn't." Denise covered her mouth. Daniel stared at the photos with growing anger. "Richard buried all of this." "No," Tom said quietly. "Richard paid enough people to bury it for him." Annie looked at the signed inspection reports again. Real signatures, real proof, not whispers anymore. Then Tom pulled out one final document. "This," he said, "is why Richard started threatening Denise." Daniel took the page first. His face hardened. Instantly. "What is it?" Annie asked. Daniel slid the paper toward her. It was an internal memo from Whitmore Development. Denise's name appeared near the bottom beside a typed instruction. "Transfer revised liability approval to Compliance Officer D. Johnson prior to state review." Annie stared at it. "They were going to blame my mother." Tom nodded slowly. If the collapse investigation reopened, Denise would have carried the responsibility. Denise looked physically sick now. "That's why Richard wanted my signature." Daniel pointed at the memo. "And when she refused, the letters started." Mrs. Carter whispered softly, "Lord have mercy." The diner suddenly felt too small. Annie looked around instinctively. 3 construction workers sat near the counter. An elderly couple shared pancakes by the window. A mother helped her son color on a paper menu. Normal morning, normal people. None of them knew a billionaire's secret sat inside a leather briefcase 10 feet away. Then Daniel noticed something. Outside. His body stiffened immediately. "What?" Annie asked. Daniel looked through the diner window toward the parking lot. A black SUV had just pulled in. Denise saw it too and froze. Tom muttered quietly, "Damn." The SUV engine remained running. Nobody stepped out. but nobody inside looked lost either. Mrs. Carter slowly set down her coffee cup. Looks like Richard's friends finally caught up. Daniel grabbed the folders quickly. We need to move. Tom shook his head. Too late for quiet now. Annie looked toward the SUV again. This time the passenger door opened. Marcus Hale stepped out wearing a dark coat despite the Georgia heat. He looked directly through the diner window at their table. Then he smiled. Nobody inside the diner moved for a second. Marcus Hale stood beside the black SUV with one hand resting casually in his coat pocket like he had arrived for brunch instead of damage control. Morning sunlight reflected off the diner windows behind him. He looked calm. That was the part Annie hated most. Daniel quietly gathered the folders into Tom's briefcase. Nobody panic, Mrs. Carter muttered. That advice always arrives after panic shows up. Denise's face had gone pale again. He found us. Tom looked through the window without surprise. Of course, he did. Marcus adjusted his tie, then started walking toward the diner entrance. Annie's heartbeat climbed hard against her ribs. Daniel looked at her directly. Whatever happens next, do not let him separate us. The diner bell rang softly as Marcus stepped inside. Several customers glanced up briefly, then returned to their meals. To them, Marcus was just another expensive man in a clean suit. Nobody could see the pressure he carried into rooms. Marcus stopped beside the booth and offered a polite smile. Good morning. Nobody answered. Marcus looked at Tom first. Mr. Wheeler, I thought retirement might have improved your judgment. Tom leaned back slowly. Funny, I thought legal school might have improved your soul. Marcus ignored the comment. His eyes shifted toward Denise. Miss Johnson. Denise said nothing. Then Marcus looked at Annie. You must be Annie. Annie met his eyes. You already know that. Marcus gave a small nod. You've caused quite a complicated week. Mrs. Carter snorted softly. That sounds prettier than threatened a teenager. Marcus finally acknowledged her presence. And you are the reason old men should watch their mouths. Tom coughed into his coffee to hide a laugh. Marcus kept his expression controlled. I came because this situation is moving toward consequences none of you fully understand. Daniel folded his arms. Funny, that seems to be everybody's favorite sentence lately. Marcus looked toward the briefcase sitting beside Tom. You possess documents belonging to Whitmore Development. Tom answered immediately. No. We possess evidence. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly. There is still time to resolve this privately, he said. Annie stared at him. You mean quietly. I mean intelligently. No, Annie replied quietly. Marcus shifted his attention toward Denise again. Miss Johnson, Richard Whitmore is willing to be generous considering the circumstances. Denise looked sick hearing the word generous. Mrs. Carter shook her head slowly. Every threat sounds polite when rich people say it slowly enough. Marcus lowered his voice. Your suspension from the clinic can disappear. Scholarships can remain untouched. Life can return to normal. Annie laughed once without humor. Normal. Marcus looked at her calmly. You are young, Annie. You still believe truth automatically defeats power. No, Annie said quietly. I just believe people get tired of being afraid. Something in Marcus's face hardened. Then he reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded document. This is a formal settlement agreement, he said. You surrender the letters and all copied materials. In exchange, Mr. Whitmore agrees not to pursue legal action. Tom stared at the paper. That sounds dangerously close to obstruction. Marcus ignored him. Miss Johnson, your mother has already suffered enough. Don't turn this into something irreversible. Annie looked at Denise. Her mother's hands were trembling again beneath the table. For a second, Annie understood the temptation. One signature, one quiet surrender. No more black SUVs. No more legal threats. No more waiting for phones to ring. Then she remembered the names. Lena Brooks, Samuel Turner, Patrice Ellis. People who never got the chance to sign their way out. Annie looked back at Marcus. What happens to the people who died at Maplewood Terrace? She asked. Marcus did not answer immediately. That tragedy was investigated years ago. That's not what I asked. Marcus kept his voice calm. Construction accidents are complicated. Tom slammed one hand against the table hard enough to rattle coffee cups. 3 people died in a building. Your client knew was unsafe. Several customers looked over now. Marcus straightened slightly. Be careful, Mr. Wheeler. No, Tom shot back. You be careful. I spent 30 years watching men like Richard hide bodies under redevelopment language. The diner had gone quieter around them. Even the waitress near the register had stopped pretending not to listen. Marcus noticed the attention immediately. For the first time, his confidence slipped a little. Daniel saw it, too. He leaned forward slowly. You made a mistake coming here in person. Marcus looked at him coldly. Did I? Yes. Daniel pointed around the diner. Now people can watch a billionaire's lawyer pressure witnesses over breakfast. Marcus's eyes narrowed. Annie suddenly understood something important. Men like Marcus depended on silence just as much as Richard did, and silence was beginning to crack. An elderly black man seated near the counter spoke up unexpectedly. Maplewood Terrace, he asked. My cousin used to live there. Nobody moved. The man looked toward Tom. You saying Whitmore knew that building was dangerous? Marcus immediately stepped in. Sir, there are legal complexities. The old man cut him off. Answer the question. The diner felt different now. Less private, more dangerous for Marcus than for them. A construction worker near the window lowered his coffee cup slowly. I remember that collapse, he muttered. Whole thing disappeared off the news. Mrs. Carter smiled faintly. Funny how truth starts breathing once enough people hear it together. Marcus realized it too late. He turned toward Annie one last time. You have no idea what you're stepping into. Annie stood slowly from the booth. No, she said, but I know exactly what my mother stepped through alone for 2 years. Marcus stared at her. Then Annie placed one of the letters on the diner table between them. The same threat Richard had denied writing. Several nearby customers leaned closer instinctively. Marcus looked at the paper. Then at the people now watching him, his voice lowered. This is not over, Daniel answered calmly. That's the first honest thing anybody from Whitmore's side has said. Marcus picked up the unsigned settlement papers and walked toward the exit without another word. Nobody in the diner looked away from him. Outside, he climbed back into the black SUV and shut the door harder than necessary. The vehicle pulled out fast this time. Not calm anymore, not patient, gone. Silence held the diner for several seconds after the SUV disappeared. Then the elderly man near the counter looked toward Annie. Your mama really kept those letters 2 years. Annie nodded. The old man shook his head slowly. That woman must have been carrying a mountain by herself. Denise lowered her eyes. Mrs. Carter reached across the booth and squeezed her hand. Not by herself anymore. Tom opened the briefcase again and carefully laid the original inspection reports beside the letters. The waitress approached quietly with the coffee pot in her hand. You folks need refills, she asked softly. Nobody answered immediately. Then Denise Johnson looked at the papers spread across the diner table at her daughter sitting beside her, at strangers beginning to understand what had been buried. And for the first time in 2 years, she spoke without whispering. Yes, Denise said, I think we do. This story reminds us that silence may protect powerful people for a while. But truth has a way of surviving through ordinary courage. Denise carried fear alone for 2 years, believing she was protecting her daughter, while Annie proved that one brave voice can force hidden injustice into the light. The story also shows how wealth and influence can bury the suffering of poor communities. But real justice begins when people stop whispering and start standing together. 16.